Hello, I'm Benjamin Miss, and welcome to Introduction to Psychology Memory. Perhaps you've already taken the experiments that I posted, and if not, you'll still have a good understanding of where we're at. It is really valuable, though, to go through the actual experimental um, experiences because it gives us kind of like some hands-on, real understanding of what it is that we're talking about. We're talking about memory. So for this coming segment, what we want to understand is the different types of memory. So right away, we're understanding that memory isn't just one thing, and it's related to different areas of function in the brain. So different types of memory are going to be directly connected to different areas, and we'll kind of go through what they are, what they do, and about where they are. Well, the three main types of memory we discuss are sensory, working, and long-term. And these relate to what we call the computer model of memory. As we know, cognitive science is heavily connected to the computer metaphor for mind. And the computer model of memory is basically storing things kind of like in the inputs, putting things in the kind of like the active memory, like the RAM, and then putting it into the long-term memory, which is like the hard drive storage. And I know that the technology is changing over time and things function differently, but it still gives a decent idea. Now, this isn't how memory works exactly, but it's a good metaphor for understanding it. So I think that's clear, right? The computer metaphor, it's not perfect, but it gives us a better window than we would have if we were simply, starting from scratch. Well, we start with Ebbinghaus. So Hermann Ebbinghaus was a really early experimental psychologist who is pretty much the reason we've known for 130 something years that cramming is bad. If you want to learn things, you spread things out. And he gave us these things, these ideas about memory, like overlearning, the way to achieve mastery in something that goes beyond just getting into your memory, and savings, like, you study, you can't quite remember what you studied, and then you study again, but it comes back a lot faster. So he started to understand how memory works and use nonsense syllables because nonsense syllables aren't connected to meaning. We saw with semantic memory, right? When we talked about the word list, if you did the experiment video, um, things are connected, and it's easier to remember things that are connected. So this was his what we call forgetting curve, and he would look at each syllable briefly. After he finished, he'd pause for 15 seconds, and then he'd see how much he could remember. He called it mastery, if he could recite each syllable without making a mistake. And he would try to relearn and see how long it took him to relearn and see how long it would last. What he found was that a lot of the material was forgotten almost immediately, like in a very short period of time. After 20 minutes, just over half of the information was still available. But then by an hour, you still have 44%, a day 33, in 6 days, you still had a quarter of it. So you have this fast decay that then kind of levels out. And this also looks a lot like if you were to stretch this out into years, um, multiple years per day, what you have is kind of like what education looks like when it comes to remembering things from courses, especially things that aren't useful is necessarily in your applied day-to-day life. I think that it's all useful in terms of helping us to understand conceptual things, but for information and facts, maybe authors' birth dates and things, that it's simply not something you are going to necessarily hold on to. Ebbinghaus also did some interesting things, and you know we look at things like vision and perception, and the Ebbinghaus illusion is part of the is part of this. Those two orange circles are exactly the same size, and if you don't believe me, pause and measure them directly on the screen. Even knowing they're the same size, they don't appear to be the same size. And that's the most fascinating part about this, is our awareness is overpowered by how we process vision, by looking at kind of the relative sizes of things to give us information about those things. So Ebbinghaus is a very interesting researcher who have had a few very famous experimental insights. Digit span was the part of memory that where we saw Miller's magic number is 7 plus or minus 2. The idea being we can grab about 7 pieces of information into our short-term memory. Now we know this decays quickly. We have activity in the frontal lobe, especially the prefrontal cortex, PFC, this area when we're kind of rehearsing and when we're kind of putting things into our memory. And we also have activity in the MTL, the medial temporal lobe, around the hippocampus area. Well, we know that once you start to get lists that are longer than 7, it's hard for most people. And as you go maybe to 9 or 11, then it gets really difficult. And very few people are able to measure that. And you think about how slogans tend to be short. You know, if you want people to buy your product, you tend to have like a nice short, clear slogan, because it's what people remember. You know, these some famous companies, it's 3 words, you know, to make sure people remember them, and they're kind of they get in there, you know, insidious and easily. Well, when we're looking at working memory, there's different components of it, including the phonological store. This is the auditory verbal working memory. And this is the part where when you are listening and producing speech, you kind of have to hold a bunch of pieces because you're putting together sentences structurally so they make sense. You know, if you just think about it like this, if you were just to grab words without having some underlying structure for them, we would say things that would be hard to understand. The structure is a big part of language. When we're hearing things, we're breaking it down because word for word is fine, but we need like the whole piece. So we've got to hold this information while we analyze it. That's our phonological store. It's also the part where someone says something and you say, what? Because you didn't quite get it, but it's still there, part of your sensory memory, and then being processed, and it can take a little while. Visual verbal, you hold while reading, similarly in this way. Visuospatial sketchpad is the visual information that you're manipulating in your mind, something, kind of turning something over, some physical thing to look at in your mind, thinking about a map. So as we kind of go through these types of memory, that's our working memory. And remember, we also have the sensory and our long-term. So I want to look at one more component of working memory, and that's the central executive. So this controls all the subsystems. So you've got these different kind of pieces, and you've perhaps heard of short-term memory, right? Short-term memory is considered to be part of working memory. The terms are used interchangeably, but they don't mean exactly the same thing. For our purposes, we'll just use working memory. And I think that's an easier way to think about it, because it's whatever you're actively paying attention to. Short-term tends to be more about the decay of information, how long things can last without what's called rehearsal, right? If you're rehearsing it in your mind, saying it over and over, you can remember it indefinitely. So if you were to maybe look at a license plate that has no meaning to you, there's no reason to remember it, but you want to remember it and write it down, and you have to say it over and over kind of in your head to do that. You have the N-back task, which takes a lot of processing. And this is an example of how we have to use different things, right? Maintaining, comparing, updating, and inhibiting information with a lot of prefrontal involvement. It's exhausting. This N-back task, I have a string of numbers here. And the reason I have the string of numbers is so that we can kind of see what I mean by it and how hard it is. So if I were to, now, if you did this task, you wouldn't see the numbers. They'd be like red to you, or you'd be seeing them flash on the screen one at a time. So if you think this is easy looking at the list, well, it is by comparison, but wait till you see the actual thing, right? So the one back is you get a number and then you say, is it the same as the one that came before? So you hear 1, 2. You can't respond until you hear that 2 because nothing came before the 1. So 1, 2, 2, 1, 2, 2. So I'm like shaking my head, nodding yes or no based on, is the number I just heard the same as the number that came before, right? So I said 1, 2, 2. That second 2 would be a yes. 1 would be a no. 2 would be a no. Another 2 would be a yes. The 2 back task is you have to go back 2 numbers. So I'd say 1, 2, 2. So you can't compare it until you hear that third number. You compare it the first number. So the first 2, 1 and 2, there's still nothing to compare to. So 1, 2, 2. You'd say no. 1, no. 2, yes. 2, no. 3, no. 2, yes. 3, yes. And I know if you're looking at this going, what are you talking about? Well, we're looking at that number list here, right? And we're comparing each number as I say it to the number that came to before it. This is a difficult task. It can often be used as a measure of cognitive function, intelligence in relation to memory, because it requires a lot of work in order to do this well. And then you do the 3 back task, and it's just like so much information. You have to have that kind of string of numbers moving through your mind, getting rid of the stuff that you're not paying attention to anymore, focusing on the stuff that you are. People with frontal lobe damage do not do well at this. All right, what is your earliest memory? Well, for most of us, it's maybe 3, age 3, maybe 4, maybe 5. It's very rare to remember things before that. And the reason is we don't store information as adults the same way we stored information as we did when we were children. So children, or I should say pre-verbal children, right? And a 1-year-old, might say a word. A 2-year-old say some words. We don't really have language, like full language, until maybe 4 and a half. But you can, get good enough at 3. We store memories through language. We store information through language. And so until we have that, our memories are stored differently. They may still exist. A Freudian might argue they're affecting us in some powerful way, but we're not able to access them because we don't have the language of before language. Well, memories have to be put into LT, long-term memory, and extracted from long-term memory, and putting them in is kind of like consolidation, and pulling them out is recall. Let's see how we do. Did these things get into your long-term memory? This type of memory is broad, but decays extremely rapidly. The fastest decay of any type of memory. Is it sensory memory, working memory, or long-term memory? And the answer is sensory memory. This was Sperling's experiment that we saw in the experiment video, where he would show an array of letters, and for 50 milliseconds, and it would disappear. And 50 milliseconds, it's 1/20th of a second. You can't read them all and put them into short-term memory. But he saw through his methodology that it was all there very briefly and could be accessed. This type of memory can last a long time, but it requires rehearsal. Is it sensory, working, or long-term? And the answer is working. Working memory appears, unlimited if you're repeating the information to yourself over and over. Like that license plate that doesn't have any semantic meaning for you other than you really want to remember it to write it down. Or you don't have your phone with you and someone gives you their phone number and you have to, you're running to get a pen and you're saying it to yourself over and over in your mind. You can keep it there while it's active. Well, we have what's called our 3-stage model of memory, which 3 major components. You've got the sensory input, which goes to sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. The idea is, if you're going to get into short-term memory, you've got to sense it first, right? You've got to sense it, get it into your senses to get it into short-term memory? Well, if you're going to get it into long-term memory, it's got to be in short-term memory. You're studying something, you're practicing it, you're saying it in your head over and over, trying to get the concept, right? Central executive, end back task, Miller's magic number, these things that we talk about. We want to get them in there. And then we look at this, bigger, more components to it in our three-stage model. We're looking at how these are functioning, right? Well, sensory memory disappears very quickly, right? If it's not there, it's gone. And we have different senses, different stores for each sentence. We have haptic memory for our touch. We have, the iconic memory for our visual information, and then acoustic memory for our auditory information, right? This very quick store, or it's called echoic, right? The acoustic information is called echoic memory for this brief sensory store of it. Now, we can still forget stuff from long-term memory. We can have slow degradation, interference, or retrieval failures where it's there, but we can't get it out. And I've heard it said, oh, it's always there, which is kind of true. It can decay. Basically, things that are unused, your brain's not going to bother with, but often bits and pieces are there. And one of the reasons why we have this idea that forgotten memories can last for a very long time, it comes from the idea of scent, right? You ever smell something and all of a sudden you have this, like, you're back somewhere from, barely remembered, like this powerful memory related to some combination of smells, right? So it's kind of like, well, you accessed it. You got a retrieval queue that was able to access information that had, well, pretty much been lost. Our long-term memory is broken down into even more components: explicit and implicit, also called declarative and non-declarative. So explicit or declarative memory is broken down into semantic and episodic. Semantic is your memory for information, facts, numbers. Episodic memory is also called autobiographical memory sometimes, and it refers to your personal experiences. Implicit memory is broken down into procedural and emotional conditioning. So maybe something happens and you have this immediate response to it, this very fast emotional response. We really tend to focus more on the procedural, which is skills and actions. How to drive a car, how to ride a bike, these are procedural skills. How about this one? The break between semantic and procedural. Knowing versus doing, in a way, right? If you type on a computer and you type without looking, okay, if I were to ask you what letters surround the L on a keyboard, can you picture it? Can you grab it easily? If I say what's near the C, what's next to the C on either side of it, and what's above and below, you might have a hard time stating it. But as you're typing, you type it no problem. You have this kind of procedural skill ability. And we know that these are unique and separate because you can have someone have a brain injury and they lose only one of these things. In terms of memory, there's a case called hyperthymesia. And so in a lot of cases, we talk about memory issues, but there's also the people who can remember everything. But it's not really everything. It's autobiographical. So they remember with themselves in the center, right? So they can tell you everything that they did or happened to them or is related to them on any day and any time as part of their memories. It's suggested they may have a larger amygdala because the amygdala is associated with this autobiographical memory and with memory, the emotional components to a certain extent, and the autobiographical parts because the emotional stuff is what ties us. Your strongest autobiographical memories are likely strongly related to emotion. They may have greater connectivity between this amygdala and the hippocampus because, again, these strong emotional connections it's right next to memory. And you look at this little schematic here, the hippocampus is right next to the amygdala. Well, the way we remember things is often through retrieval cues. It's some kind of stimulus, internal or external, that activates information stored in long-term memory. Interestingly, state, how you feel, can be related to your memories and your ability to retrieve them. So these cues are recorded at the same time. So think about it like encoding specificity. You are in class, and as you're learning something, you're encoding information in that environment. It gives you a cue, what you're looking at. You ever, I would do this in classes myself, where I'm sitting there, I couldn't remember something. I'd look up and I'd look at the classroom, and I would just kind of like look around, and it would come back. You were using the visual cues of the space around you to remember things. I don't know, you want to keep your head down. Oh, I'm not cheating, I'm not cheating. But so maybe it's better to sit in the front, so you could look up and kind of look around without being sus. When it comes to these conditions, it's helpful. So if you're studying for a psych test, you should probably take the test in the same room you study in. For a lot of us, I mean, are you moving your computer around, your phone? Where are you doing these things? Right? It can actually, depending on how you learn, it could be fine. But it could also, if you really want to just boost your performance, you study right there, where you are. Another way to think about it is context-dependent memory. They gave scuba divers lists of words while underwater and while on land. So they got one list underwater and one on land. And they studied those lists. And then they were tested, a while later, an equal number of time for both, for every condition. They were tested underwater and on land on both lists. Well, the list they learned on land, they remembered better on land. The list they learned underwater, you guessed it, they learned better, they remembered better underwater. There was something about the context. And that's what I mean about, how you feel, state-dependent memory. If you feel a certain way, let's say you're having just a really bad day, it might not be the best day to study. You might not have the same effect because when you're trying to pull it, you're not able to grab it. But time matters too. Your circadian rhythms are going to be involved in this. So are you a morning person? Are you an evening person? Well, whenever you're taking class, that's when you're taking your tests. So that's also when you should be studying. So on days that you don't have class, let's say you have an 11 a.m. class. Well, on days you don't have class, study from 11 to 12. That memory information is going to be much more accessible. Study right before class, right after class. You can increase your memory, increase your performance, and in the long run, decrease the amount of time you have to study. And come on, isn't that the goal, right? Study smarter, not harder. Here's some questions for you. Jason Bourne from the Bourne Identity could not remember anything about his life, but he could remember his skills and he could get along in society. He lost his what? Working memory, procedural memory, episodic memory, or semantic memory? The answer is episodic memory. Dory from Finding Nemo has trouble remembering people. She likely has trouble with her semantic, episodic, procedural, or emotional conditioning. In Dory's case, it was probably also episodic. She couldn't remember things from her life very well, right? So it's probably the same kind of thing for her. Episodic memories are memories for ourselves and for our own experiences. She also had terrible short-term memory, or I should say working memory. No, short-term. Information would disappear from her very quickly. All right. If a person has damage to both amygdalae, right, your amygdala on the left and the right hemisphere, they will no longer be afraid of things they used to be afraid of, and they will be unable to learn fear. They would have trouble with, and this would be semantic, episodic, procedural, or emotional conditioning. Here, we're probably looking at emotional conditioning. So these things are gone. You just have no memory for the experience. right? Not only are these things not affecting them, they have no memory for it. So they're losing this, and that means that, again, brain areas, the amygdala is probably what we're talking about here with emotional conditioning. Fears are often healthy because they remind us what to avoid. This is also called similar. I'm not sure if it's used in the terms used for humans, but for other species that have both amygdala removed, it's Kluver-Bucy syndrome. Now we look at the processes of long-term memory. Encoding is putting information into a way that we can then store and retrieve it. So this can work for both short-term working and long-term, because it's how are you taking information from your sensory environment and turning it into something that you can understand and process. Then and this is involvement, hippocampus, we called that the medial temporal lobe, and the prefrontal cortex, we called that the PFC. The consolidation is stabilizing these things into long-term memory so they can be stored and recalled. This is specifically the hippocampus. And then retrieval appears to be in many different areas, and this is how we pull things out. Well, recall is information must be pulled out of memory. It's like short answer questions on a test, right? It's like, okay, can you get this? Like Jeopardy, here's a question, can you recall this information? Recognition is more like multiple choice, where it's like, okay, is this part of the definition? Is this part of this thing? So there's different types of tests, but in all of them, we're pulling things out of our memory, which is why testing ourselves is good. Serial position, we saw in the experiment video, where we were really good at remembering the primacy stuff. The recency stuff is really good, but if you wait after the recency, if you take a break, that crashes. We lose that very quickly. So the spreading activation model is related to our sensory memory. We saw how if we get a word, other words automatically come up. We saw that with the Rodinger-McDermott word lists and some other examples. Well, priming is part of this. So consider you heard the word, doctor when you heard the words nurse, dentist, and patient. So if there was a word list, one of the lists, Rodinger-McDermott lists looks like that. But with priming, they do something a little bit different. They'll flash the word doctor on a screen, and it's going to start to, activate related words. Then one of three conditions. You will either see nurse, purse, or blim, a non-word. Well, if you flash the word, you have to mark the word as a word or a non-word. You flash the word blim on the screen, non-word, whatever. You flash the word nurse on the screen, word. You flash the word purse on the screen, word. The key is they heard each of these words after seeing, or they saw each of these words after seeing the word doctor. So you see the word doctor, and it activates nurse. So even though you didn't hear the word nurse, you're primed. So people would respond faster to the word nurse and mark it as a word. There's a concept called the engram, which is kind of like where in the brain is memory. And Lashley called it like a physical change in the brain associated with learning and memory. And he destroyed larger and larger parts of the monkey cortex looking for this engram. And he argues that all parts of the brain are equally active in memory storage, and this is called equipotentiality. The memories are spread out in the brain. Now, this is generally true, but some more recent evidence suggests that the cerebellum is actually the location for the engram when it comes to classical conditioning, which is what Lashley was doing. But at the time, we thought we knew what the cerebellum did, so it was associated with movement and stuff, and not really so much these other things. So a lot of brain areas are involved in learning, and we have what's called synaptic plasticity. Synaptic plasticity is the idea that our brains can change. Well, as you're learning things, you're storing them. As you're learning things, you're putting them into your brain. And in order to store them long term, you've got to make changes to your brain. You've got to do something to your brain in order to get these things in. So here's some of these locations. Here's the hippocampus, the entorhinal cortex, which is basically part of the temporal lobe that's right around the hippocampus. The amygdala, we said, is right next to the hippocampus. The striatum, which wraps around the thalamus in the same general area. The left parietal cortex and the prefrontal regions. All of these involved in memory. Here's our other major areas. Here's our prefrontal cortex, another look at the amygdala, and another look at the hippocampus. All right, so the hippocampus is like wrapping around, connected to the thalamus basically, and the amygdala, and these things are kind of deep in the temporal lobe, which is where we associate memory. The amygdala is our emotional conditioning, the prefrontal cortex, working memory, cerebellum, classical conditioning, hippocampus, encoding. And when we even consider where our procedural memory is, that would be our basal ganglia. And our basal ganglia is another set of structures that is kind of, a set of structures that's deep, that's also around the thalamus. So some of these are also involved. In terms of this plasticity, in terms of this changing, Hebb called it, the way that this is described is neurons that fire together, wire together. Okay, so the stronger this connection, the more these two neurons are firing together, the stronger their connection becomes. And they, in a sense, wire together. The synapse between them becomes strengthened. Hebbian learning is called long-term potentiation, and there's changes in the neurons themselves, an increase in the number of receptors and the amount of neurotransmitters. If you're learning anything in these videos, if you're remembering any of this, then you are having physical changes to your brain. But what happens when memory is not recalled? Well, there's some kind of retrieval failure happening. And we're going to take a moment and talk about one of the famous cases, formerly known as HM. They removed a bunch of tissue in his medial temporal lobe and disrupted consolidation. And it, as sad as it was for him, it taught us a lot about how memory works in the brain. Hippocampal damage is associated with anterior grade amnesia, basically the inability to put new information into your memory. Retrograde amnesia is generally associated with head injury. So here is Henry Molaison, and this is how things kind of changed for him over time. As he aged, he had no memory for age, right? He had surgery in 1953, so he was still been a young man, in order to deal with these debilitating seizures. So he had epilepsy that was so bad he couldn't function. And so neurosurgeon William Beecher Scoville operated on him and took out huge chunks of the temporal lobe on both sides. Scoville's been kind of referred to as a bit of a surgical cowboy, like, oh, let's do this. And it left Molaison with the inability to form new memories. When I was learning about him, we still called him HM. It was only after he died where they released more information about him and about his life. He contributed a great deal to our understanding of memory. And yet he had a great was unable to function after his surgery because he couldn't put new information into the long-term memory. Incredible anterior grade amnesia. He would meet someone and they would leave the room and come back 15 minutes later, and it would be like meeting them all over again. He could remember things if he rehearsed it. And then once he stopped rehearsing the information, it was gone. Now there's debate about this, because not only did he have his hippocampi removed, he also lost a bunch of the entorhinal cortex and his amygdala, which probably made it easier for him to accept change. Because imagine if it was you and the only thing that changed was your memory. You couldn't make new memories, but every day when every time you looked in the mirror, you expected to see a person 10 years, 20 years, 30 years younger, right? And you had someone else looking back at you. Without the amygdala, he'd be less likely to have distress. Well, here's about what was removed, and we see how much of his brain was resectioned, right? These huge chunks of brain removed from his temporal lobe, the areas associated with memory, autobiographical memory, semantic memory in the parahippocampal gyri, and emotion in the amygdala. So these two main types of amnesia are the anterograde, like HM, and the case, if you've seen the movie Memento, where the character is kind of like, it's shot in a way that almost makes you feel as if you're going, you're losing you don't have this kind of ability to form new memories. And there's some other cases of retrograde. Dory's an interesting case, right, from Finding Dory, because she forgot stuff that happened before, but it's likely that it was actually an inability to make new memories, which was part of the problem. So Dory's a bad example all around. The way her memory worked seemed a little odd. Scott Bolzan, however, was a famous case where doctors argued that he was lying. Okay, because they're like, no, this is too perfect retrograde amnesia. He had a fall and he lost his life. He lost all of his memories. And he had family try to help him and kind of bring him back. But he still was missing a lot of his memory. And later on, they saw that, oh, wow, he had some blood flow issues and he had huge amounts of damage to both hemispheres in his brain that seemed to be related to this retrograde amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is often associated with trauma or with some kind of like a psychological effect. When you look at memory and why it's so important that we study memory, we consider that when it comes to exonerations, DNA exonerations, you look at what it was that was primary in getting them, getting people convicted, and you have, forensic issues, false confessions, informants, things that are very, very shady and dubious. But the biggest one is eyewitness misidentification. Right? So how many of these things, and yeah, convictions can be based on more than one cause, but 72% of these wrongful convictions, right? These were just the first 325 DNA exonerations were eyewitness misidentification. Our memories are terrible and highly suggestible. An unethical cop could say to somebody, a witness, oh yeah, we caught somebody, or over here we caught somebody. They were wearing a yellow jacket, and then they ask the person later, so what was the person wearing? And they're like, oh yeah, it was a yellow jacket, right? They don't realize they're lying. They're not trying to lie, but they're updating their memory based on new information. That's not how you're supposed to do identification, but that's how people do memory. And I'm not saying, I think maybe the cop really thought that they had the right person and didn't realize that all these things were contributing to kind of going the wrong direction and creating this miscarriage of justice. When you look at how you can influence people, if you're ever in a car accident and you hit them, you want to use the word contacted. Because Loftus, and we'll talk about her work, fantastic work on memory, they did an experiment where they gave people these scenarios where a car accident happened, and then they used different words, and then they had the person estimate how fast the driver was going. When they used the word contacted, the estimate was much slower than when they used the word smashed. It influenced after the fact how they remembered it. by asking about smashed glass in a scenario where there was no smashed broken glass. When asking about it, it influenced people's memory for there having been broken glass in the accident. So there's all these huge issues when it comes to how people are influenced by the terminology. Well, the idea of repressed memory originated with Freud writing about hysteria. Now, part of the tragedy of Freud is Freud believed his patients had been abused, but then he was, convinced or kind of bullied by his peers that they were making it up, that it was part of this fantasy, and he kind of went with that and denied, what he knew, and even fought against the truth. So the idea of repressed memories, if it's real, it's rare, right? The idea that if something's not, maybe there's something you don't want to talk about, maybe there's something you don't want to think about, but the memory is there. It's not like repressed to the point of it's driving you but unavailable. Loftus began studying false memory because what happened was there were a number of patients who were suddenly remembering that they'd suffered horrific abuse at the hands of their parents, right? Satanic stuff. And Loftus noticed a pattern that either there were like a large number of Satanists in Southern California who were like torturing and murdering their children, or something really scary was happening in therapy where these therapists were implanting memories. And she faced a lot of pushback, threats, insults, because of her work on this. Once a memory is in there, it's in there, right? But people remembering things like one case, someone remembered that they had a sibling that had been murdered by their parents and buried in the basement by a cult. They went, and the basement was concrete. There wasn't a dirt floor, as remembered. They dug it up anyways, and there was nothing there. There was no evidence for any of these. And so there was this kind of question. Let me ask you a question about memory. So let's do another test, right? So here is a memory, and I want you to think about your experiences, and we read this. Disneyland is a fun place to take a vacation, filled with magic and fun. You can ride roller coasters, play games, and meet your favorite characters. A day at Disneyland can be one of the best days of your life. And they asked, people to kind of like think about, what's here's an ad, and think about, is this a good ad for Disneyland, right? And so what they were looking at is not, is this a good ad? They were looking at people's memory. So you're looking at how fast false memories could be created. And I want you to think about that last one. False memories are created the same way real memories are created. And I'm going to talk about 3 of Elizabeth Loftus's famous studies in regards to this. The first one was the special mobile at birth. So basically telling people, here's a memory test. Oh, you did so well. It must, where were you born? Oh, at that hospital, they had these special mobiles there. And it was like this new thing that should have enhanced your memory. Then later on, they asked people, what's your first memory? And they were like, oh, I was a newborn in the hospital. I remember this mobile. No, you can't remember that stuff, right? You can't remember being a newborn. You're not remembering your own birth, right? It's just no. Another study, Lost in the Mall. They had the subject's parents, so the students' parents were involved, and they gave the researchers 2 real things that happened during their childhood. And then they inserted one that didn't, this Lost in the Mall. And each of these stories were in depth. They had a lot of detail. In the Lost in the Mall study, it was talking about who found them and what the environment looked like and what they did after and all this stuff. And then they asked people, after they discussed them, do you remember these? And nobody remembered the false memory events, but they remembered most of the true events, right? Well, then they asked him again. They called him back in for another interview. Hey, we want to talk about your memories for those events. The true events were stronger, but all of a sudden, people were remembering what didn't happen. And by the third interview, about a quarter of people were remembering something that never happened, suggesting that memory is incredibly malleable. These memories were then in there. You can't get them out. These people remembered this experience of being lost in the mall, this very specific experience. Now, the last one was probably the most creative because this was about meeting Bugs Bunny at Disneyland. And, so the question is, can you meet Bugs Bunny at Disneyland? Look, here's a still from a movie with Bugs and Mickey from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Well, actually, you can't. And the only reason that there was apparently some big deal to get, permission from both, all the copyright holders to allow both, the Warner Brothers and Disney characters to be in the same movie. Well, if Bugs Bunny went to Disneyland, Bugs Bunny would get kicked out fast because he's not a Disney character, right? So they got people and they gave them these different conditions where the first group just read an ad about the theme park, no mention of characters. The second group read the same ad, but there was a 4-foot tall cutout of Bugs Bunny in the room. The third group had both the fake Disneyland had first a fake Disneyland featuring a Bugs Bunny, and the fourth group had both Bugs, the fake ad, and the cutout. And the participants who read the phony ad, a third of them remembered meeting Bugs Bunny at the Magic Kingdom, right? And a lot of them said they met him and they shook his hand. They remembered an event that could not possibly have happened because of how it was framed. I mean, they were talking about meeting Bugs Bunny like it was a real thing that was common, like not a big deal. And people put it into their memory as part of their experience at Disney. I love this quote from a Loftus paper. In essence, all memory is false to some degree. Memory is inherently a reconstructive process whereby we piece together the past to form a coherent narrative that becomes our autobiography. In the process of reconstructing the past, we color and shape our life's experiences based on what we know about the world. Our job as memory researchers and as human beings is to determine the portion of memory that reflects reality and the portion that reflects inference and bias. This is no simple feat, but one worthy of our continued investigation. She says all memory is false to some degree. We're filling in the pieces, right? It's all scattered. And we put together a narrative that becomes this autobiography. But how much of your autobiography is really your experience? A couple other ideas in memory errors, like why do problems happen? Schachter gives us the 7 sins of memory. Transience, which is we forget over time. Absent-mindedness, which we're not paying attention to everything. Blocking is related to the tip of the tongue phenomenon. It's there, you just can't quite name it. It's like half of your quiz, right? You're like, oh, I know this one. Misattribution. We forget the source. I'm terrible at this. Someone will tell me a joke. I'll tell the same person the same joke. The next day they'll be like, I just told you that joke. Suggestibility. False memory, right? We're very susceptible. Bias is distortion caused by our belief system. We remember things more maybe that fit our belief system than don't. And persistence. It's tough to forget undesirable memories. We also have a certain type of interference, proactive and retroactive. And so there's a good mnemonic for this. It's PORN, P-O-R-N. Proactive, old, retroactive, new. This is going to help you remember these concepts on the quiz, right? So proactive interference is caused by old. You learn something and something you learned before. Proactive is interfered with proactively. Retroactive is caused by new. So something that was in your memory is now interfered with by something you just learned. Retroactive interference is affecting an old memory by new information. So proactive, old, retroactive, new. If you remember that, boom, you're going to get more. Mnemonics are a good way of improving our memory. How do we use this to improve our lives? This area, a discussion on memory, we can absolutely look at it. Review before a test, right? So you have all your information organized. You make time for a half hour before the test to go over it. This isn't cramming. This isn't like you're learning it. This is reviewing. Rehearsal. Study often. Exercise and sleep well. We know that if you don't sleep, you don't clear out the stuff that you don't need to remember. I mean, that sounds a little weird, but basically, as you go through your day, you pick up things that you don't need. And sleep helps you to clear those out to make space and also to kind of, help with our memories. And use mnemonic devices. Speaking of mnemonics, what type of interference disrupts something you're trying to learn now? Proactive, retroactive, new, or old? What type of interference disrupts something you are trying to learn? Well, we go to the mnemonic porn. Proactive is caused by old, retroactive is caused by new. So this would be proactive because it's old information interfering with new. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion on memory, and even more so, see how useful it is in enhancing our ability to learn and to perform well, and also to understand how bad it is. If you're arguing with a loved one about what really happened, you're probably both wrong, and maybe just move on. Thank you.